Hello and welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. I'm your host, Michael Washington, Director of the Afro-American Studies Program at Northern Kentucky University. And as you know, our program, Afrocentricity, is the community education broadcast. We have a very, very interesting program today entitled Myths of Jazz. And we have a self-proclaimed jazz aficionado and he will tell us what that means. Our guest, Mr. William Lawless Jones. How are you doing, Mr. William Lawless Jones?
Oh, fine. Happy to be here.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Let me ask you a quick question here. How could such a law-abiding citizen as yourself have the middle name of Lawless?
Well, it's a family name. It's the name of a family that my father was very much friendly with, I should say. So he decided to give me that middle name.
All right, to let you be a bit radical in your persuasion. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about you before we talk about the actual concept of jazz, the myths of jazz. Try to get some background on yourself. I first met you at the University of Cincinnati in undergraduate school back in the early 1970s when you were a professor of sociology there. So hence I'm one of the few people that walk around calling you Professor Jones, but that's what I've always called you, and so that's what I call you now.
Yeah, I was in University College over there, the Open Admissions College, for something like 6 or 7 years as teaching sociology. Yeah, that's right. And in the evenings in the College of Continuing Education, they call it. At that time, they had what they call the Communiversity program. I used to teach appreciation and history of African American classical music, which is actually what jazz is.
Okay, so jazz, African American classical music.
That's right.
Just a little bit more about you. Now, you also, for about 15 years or so, have been a news commentator on a local TV program, the NAACP Presents. Is that
right? NAACP Presents. Yeah, it still airs on Sunday mornings.
Okay, Sunday mornings.
Yeah, right.
And didn't it used to do a column in the Enquirer, jazz?
Some 25 years ago, I did jazz reviews for the Enquirer for a year or so. Yeah.
Now, jazz. Is it okay to ask when you were born?
Yeah, 1914, I can tell you, yeah.
And that would be really, if you take a look at that year, the first year of World War I.
Right, in Europe, that is.
In Europe, right. We didn't get involved until 1917 over here. But jazz was really, as an art form, was just in its beginning stages, would you say?
Well, no, I think you'd have to say after World War I. I think you'd have to say it, or possibly during World War I. In fact, a famous African-American band leader, Jim Europe, of all names, was in Europe at the time, and I think he sometime, I think maybe you could say maybe he had one of the first jazz bands, you might say.
No.
But I think that after World War I is when jazz really got going, like around 1920, I would say.
Okay, but now keep in mind now, is this myth or fact that there was a fellow named Charles Buddy Bolden who was considered to have the first jazz band, and that was probably around 1905 or so, if I'm not mistaken. Is that?
I'm not sure the exact time, but yeah, there was a Buddy Bolden, and he's sort of a legend in New Orleans as being able to blow louder and higher than anybody at that time. Yeah, and I'm not sure the exact dates on that.
So when we say 1914, well, I mean, we're talking about really the beginning of this art form emerging. And so I'm just trying to establish the point here that here you are, a jazz enthusiast, and your word is aficionado, and you can tell us what that word means.
Well, it simply means somebody sort of obsessed with it to the point where you study it and you read everything about it, and you can't wait to go to the next jazz concert.
Now, let me ask this question. For many years, here's a magazine called Nip Magazine. This is one of the older issues. And This is 1975, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
You started doing your jazz column in Nip magazine back in 1969.
That's right.
And you still do that column, is that right?
Right.
So would it be fair to say, and this is one of the earlier columns, it was called Digging the Disc by Lawless Bill,
Yeah.
the 14th Annual Ohio Valley Cool Jazz Festival in those days. If perhaps you can get a close-up on that. You can see how, this is 1970, this is a 21-year-old edition of this particular journal or magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you've been doing it much longer than 24 years. And you perhaps are the longest, you're responsible for the longest running, continuous running jazz column, perhaps in the local history here, local area here.
I think you could safely say that, yes. Mm-hmm.
As a result of that, folks, you'll be the first to hear that me and Professor Jones here have been discussing collaborating on a book, of which the book will be his experiences and a compilation of all of those articles that he's written over the years. And we're experimenting now with the title, and I think we said something like Digging That Joyous Jazz, because that's the name of
that's the
article
current
now.
name of the article, yeah.
And then there'll be a subtitle, The Memoirs of a Jazz, and we'll say aficionado.
Sounds good.
Does that sound pretty good?
Yeah, it sounds good.
And we're talking about this project, and we'll be starting on this probably within the next few weeks or so, pulling a book together. And my students, of course, in my Afro-American Introduction to Afro-American Studies course will be the lucky ones to be able to read that book. And basically it will be a book of the years of experience, the years of articles that he's written that we're going to get published, because there's a lot of good, a lot of wealth in terms of background on jazz music. But so much for that. Let's go back to talking about myths of jazz. Now, let's talk about jazz as an art form. There is the myth, as you know, that jazz as an art form came into existence in New Orleans. There had been Congo Square. I think they started dancing there around 1817 or so. The Africans, Congo Square was the only place in the United States where they allowed Africans to beat their drums and to dance on Sundays. And you had that influence. So you had the French influence. You had the Spanish influence in music there. And the old argument is that jazz got its origins, in a sense, after the Civil War, as a result of the Creoles now having to face discrimination in a sense, and people who had been trained as musicians, formerly trained as musicians, combining the black experience with the Congo Square kind of thing, and you get this emergence of jazz. Is that a myth, or is that reality or fact?
Well, jazz has its origins in black or Negro spirituals, as they would call, and the blues. And Negro spirituals, of course, started, prior to the Civil War, and of course, out of the spirituals, we also get gospel eventually, which is really the spirituals with a rhythm set to them. But now the blues came out of after the Civil War, and you had all these troubadours with banjos or guitars or whatever, and they were happy to get away from the plantation. They would travel around, and they would sing the blues to whatever audience was able to throw a few dollars to them, and so. I usually say that the spirituals was the mother of jazz, and the blues was the daddy of jazz, and then of course it evolves on. You have right after the Civil War. Later on, there comes ragtime, which gives it a little structure, and makes the people have to learn how to read, because jazz originally was played by people who didn't read music. See, they didn't read music, particularly most of them, and if they did, they just maybe knew some of the basics. But then Scott Joplin, who was the main ragtime man, came along and wrote these pieces with with a certain format to them, and you had to learn to read the notes in order to play them. So ragtime contributed a little bit of what shall I say, formal structure
to jazz.
To jazz. Yeah.
Now, because a lot of people would say that ragtime could be considered jazz music, but then the question of improvisation comes into play. And
right.
A lot of people think jazz as an art form is improvisation, but then you would think of people like Scott Joplin, who it wasn't necessarily improvised, it was written down.
Right.
You think of people like Benny Goodman's trios and quartets and so forth, and again, written down. Count Basie's orchestra, that's jazz. But again, written down. What role does improvisation play?
Now Count Basie's band was practically all improvised. In fact, most of the things that the Basie band played originally were what we call head arrangements, which means the whole ensemble improvised the thing right at rehearsal or whatever. They would get this riff together, and then based upon this riff, people would take solos and so forth. The soloists would operate. So it's probably the hardest swinging, most consistently swinging band in history was the Count Basie band. Yeah.
But the improvisation piece, in other words, jazz, improvisation is a strong element, but not necessarily the complete aspect of the music.
Right. Improvisation is one of the principal elements, and then of course there's this indefinable essence element, which Duke Ellington called swing, way before 2 years or so before Benny Goodman calls himself the king of swing.
Now wait a minute. Now are you saying that it's a myth that in all these jazz books that I read, and I see that Benny Goodman, and I think it was in 1935 or 36, 35, I think, in a place called the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles, California, he was so well received that he began to be known at that point as the king of swing. Are you saying that that's a myth?
If anybody's the king of swing, it would be Duke Ellington or Count Basie. Duke Ellington, because he coined the term swing to identify this essence of jazz, or Count Basie, whom I say consistently outswung almost everybody. See, in Goodman's band, the only one who really felt this thing called swing was Goodman himself. The rest of the people in the band could just read the charts, and of course that meant that the ensemble could swing, but when you got ready to take a solo, the only soloist swinging was Benny Goodman. Harry James wasn't swinging at that time.
But he learned to swing eventually, though, didn't he?
And of course the saxophonists that tried to take a solo were corny as they could be, and later on, of course, Harry James finally, after many, many years, he gets his own band and everything, and finally he learns how to swing. But see, Goodman is one of these rare white people, you might say, who feels it down deep inside like the Negro did, see, and so he could really swing.
Well, let me say this, though. Also in the books, they say that Benny Goodman was responsible for integrating the first integrated band in 1936 when he introduced. Of course, it was a backdoor kind of a thing with Lionel Hampton on the vibes and Teddy Wilson on the piano. And could not qualify him to be the
well, he didn't.
king?
He really didn't integrate the band, because what he made out of these were small auxiliary groups. Actually, the first person to really integrate a band was Duke Ellington too, because Duke Ellington had Juan Tizol, who was this white Puerto Rican in his trombone section. Again, a couple of years
that was in 34, wasn't it? 1934.
Before Goodman came along with a band. Now the first white band leader to integrate was I guess you'd have to say Artie Shaw, because
before 36.
Yeah, because no.
Oh, you mean big band?
I mean big band, big white band. Was Artie Shaw, and the next one was
Stan.
Well, Artie Shaw had Billie Holiday, see, and then next one was Gene Krupa, who broke away from Goodman. The drummer broke away from Goodman in 1940, and wanted the best trumpet player in his band, and he got Roy Eldridge and put him right on the bandstand with the rest of the band. He was not one of these special attractions like Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton were with Goodman. See, Teddy Wilson should have been playing piano with Goodman's band.
That's right.
And Goodman had this little rinky-dink guy playing piano, some guy named Jess Stacy, who all he could do was chord. You know, he couldn't play a solo. See? But Teddy Wilson could have been playing solos with the big band.
But it was against the racial codes of the day, and I think he knew the music, and he knew that these African Americans could play, and I think he took some risk. Would you say he took some risk, though, with even putting them into these?
Not really.
You don't think so?
Shaw and Krupa took risks.
That was in the 40s, though. That was a little bit later.
Yeah, well, okay, all right.
Wouldn't you say they kind of broke it up a little bit?
Yeah,
in terms
maybe
of the white
did. Yeah.
bands?
Of course, he also did it at the insistence of his very liberal brother-in-law, John Hammond, who was a record producer for Columbia Records. You see, Goodman married into the Vanderbilt family. See, Goodman married a Vanderbilt, and got John Hammond as a brother-in-law. See?
Now he actually recorded in 1933 with Billie Holiday, if I'm not mistaken. Would that be fair to say? Billy Goodman recorded a piece with her. In the early 30s?
This was strictly a recording studio thing, and this had nothing to do with Goodman as a band leader. This was one of those little pickup band things. But interestingly enough, Paul Whiteman, we didn't talk about Paul Whiteman yet, did we?
I was going to ask you about that whole question of the concept of king. The myth of the concept of the king.
But, yeah, okay. What I was going to tell you was Paul Whiteman, who always wanted to make jazz respectable, made a record with with his band, with Billie Holiday as vocalist, called Traveling Light. It's a blues, Traveling Light. Paul Whiteman and his orchestra, and Billie used her AKA Lady Day, you know, that Lester Young called her Lady Day, you know. So it's vocal by Lady Day because she's under obligation to another record company and like that. But Paul Whiteman did a service to jazz in a way. In 1924, he had these society bands, see, but he wants to play jazz, so he had Bix Beiderbecke in his band and another guy named Frankie Trumbauer who wanted to be a jazz man. And he had this concert at Aeolian Hall, so-called, in New York City. And he called the concert Innovations in Modern Music, or something to that effect. And he introduced a young composer with a work that Paul himself had paid for him to, had commissioned him to do, Rhapsody in Blue. So it was George Gershwin performing Rhapsody in Blue in 1924 with Paul Whiteman's orchestra, and that was the big highlight of that concert. And out of that, you got this famous extended work, which is a jazz work, see, a Rhapsody in Blue. George Gershwin, who was another one of these rare white individuals who felt that swing thing. He really did, you know.
Now, but wasn't Paul Whiteman considered the king of jazz?
Yeah, that's right. Behind this, he billed himself or his press agents did, as the king of jazz.
And he carried that title, right? I mean,
That's
then,
right.
Of course, Benny Goodman would come along and be
Yeah.
the king of swing.
Right.
Of course, those days, I guess they're talking about
Yeah.
Dixieland.
Yeah. Now, if anybody in 1924 or 5 would be the king of jazz, it would be Louis Armstrong.
Now, why would you assert such a thing about Louis Armstrong? We know he innovated the trumpet, the solo, and we know he was the best.
Louis Armstrong taught everybody how to phrase on a horn and how to phrase with your voice to get maximum swing capability.
Was he also the founder of the whole scat concept?
Well, yeah, he started scat singing too. But the main thing is, if you get beyond that gravelly voice, it's the way he emphasizes the words and the way the words are just off the beat and just behind the beat and so forth that makes for the swing concept. He sang just like he played trumpet, and the way he sang and played made you not be able to sit still. You had to move some part of your anatomy when Louis Armstrong sang or played.
So what you're saying is in a sense, in the field of jazz, this whole concept of king is very similar to the concept of king of rock and roll, like with Elvis Presley, for instance. I mean, we know a lot of where that music came from that Elvis was singing, but he could acquire the title of king.
Yeah, and I'm not being a big fan of rock and roll. I imagine that somebody else, maybe Little Richard should have been the king of rock and roll. I don't want to get into that. Maybe Elvis really was the king of rock and roll.
Because King Oliver actually in the late teens, early 20s, from New Orleans, of course, going up to Chicago. Louis Armstrong was his mentee, I guess you might say. He became his protege.
Right.
And of course, he was King Oliver.
That's right.
In terms of what he called himself. But some of these other guys would become the king because of their contribution to this particular music, I would say.
No, King Oliver was dubbed the king there in New Orleans because he was the principal trumpet player that back there in the early 20s. And of course, like you said, Armstrong was sort of like a student of his. And so, but the student got better than the teacher, is what it amounted to, which is good. That's the way it's supposed to be. And when King Oliver went to Chicago, as soon as he could, he sent for Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong came to Chicago, and South Side of Chicago was just teeming with great musicians and everything by the mid-20s, and on into the 30s. And they, for one thing, every theater had a big pit band, believe it or not, at that time.
So you would subscribe to the whole argument then that, because some people would say it's a myth that jazz came up the Mississippi River from New Orleans to Chicago. Some people would, for instance, look at people like Freddie Keppard in the early century, right about the time you were being born. 1912, I think he left New Orleans. 1914, I think he went to Los Angeles. Then he ended up in Philadelphia in 1918, and had been in New York in 1915. So that doesn't follow that whole pattern of coming up the Mississippi River. Would you say that was more of an anomaly, or he was more different, but the general pattern?
Yeah, he was. See, Chicago became a big haven for jazz musicians. Of course, there were jazz musicians in other places. Dallas, for example, had a couple of good jazz bands. In fact, believe it or not, there was a black band playing in one of the principal white hotels in Dallas, Texas, of all places, back in the late 20s and early 30s. But Chicago, south side of Chicago was it rivaled New York or New Orleans for a long time. It was bigger than New York City in the 30s there for a while, see? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Mecca for jazz is New York City. It has been for 60-something years.
And you yourself still visit New York every summer to go to various...
Yeah, I got to go there. go to the Village Vanguard and Sweet Basil and Fat Tuesdays and all those places. Yeah.
You'll be going in a couple of weeks or so, huh?
Right. Yeah.
Well, that'd be good. I would like to tag along with you.
Yeah.
Going back to some trumpet players, though, 1945, Miles Davis, and you'll comment on your opinion of Miles as a trumpeter. I think he was going there to attend a Juilliard School of Music there, and ended up following Clark Terry. Clark Terry was just here, incidentally, last week at which you invited me to come to there at the Swifton,
the Swifton Jazz Series.
And of course, is that any truth to that Terry became Miles Davis's #1 main influence?
I'm not sure about that, but everybody learned a whole lot from Clark Terry as far as that goes.
We got about a minute left, so.
Yeah, but see, Miles got off the beaten track side with this thing he called Bitch's Brew, which is a bitch, really. It into this electronic fusion type stuff, which I really think is confusion, right? And so that turned me off. But Miles did very well for a long time. But in the '60s, though, he sold out to commercial
because
music.
of the electronic stuff.
Yeah, that electronic stuff. Yeah. But he never was really as good as like Clifford Brown or Fats Navarro or somebody like that. He was an adequate trumpet player, I would say.
And what about Monk? A lot of people consider Monk's music, everything he wrote was like composition versus, say, lines like Charlie Parker, for instance. How would you distinguish the difference between Monk's writing? We got about 30 seconds.
Monk, I think, was a great composer because he composed these jazz pieces that jazz men could take these chord progressions and improvise to the maximum degree on them. All you have to do is listen to some of his things like Straight Note Chaser and Round Midnight and many more that he wrote. He's one of the greatest jazz composers ever, if not the greatest
composer ever.
And we had another one right here in Ohio too, Tad Dameron, I might mention.
Okay, and we're going to pick back up on this, but our time has just run out. This is an absolute wonderful discussion with Mr. William Lawless Jones, Professor Jones. And until next time, thank you and good night.